Why is it that the harder you try to make someone like you, the faster you get exactly the opposite of what you were looking for? Pause for a second before you keep listening, because this question hides one of the most uncomfortable contradictions in human psychology, and you have probably lived it firsthand more than once without fully understanding why it happened. Think of a time in your life when you desperately wanted someone to like you. You sent messages, carefully weighing every word. You cancelled your own plans just to stay available. You smiled at comments that deep down did not even strike you as funny. And despite all that effort, or maybe precisely because of it, the other person drifted away little by little, as if your devotion, instead of pulling them closer, pushed them further away. This is not bad luck. It does not mean you were not enough or that you needed to try even harder next time. What happened responds to a deep psychological mechanism studied from very different angles by behavioral psychology, the neuroscience of desire, and attachment theory. And today I want to walk you through that mechanism calmly, without rushing, so you can stop repeating a pattern that has probably been sabotaging your most important relationships for years without you even realizing it. Before we go on, I need to be completely honest with you about something because this topic lends itself easily to misunderstanding, and I would rather clear it up right now instead of letting the confusion set in halfway through the video. We are not going to talk about tricks for manipulating anyone or calculated strategies for faking disinterest in order to trap someone else. That kind of approach, even though it circulates all over the internet disguised as relationship wisdom, is actually manipulation, plain and simple. And in the long run, it builds hollow bonds based on game playing instead of real connection. What we are going to explore today is something much deeper and much more honest. Why genuine self-security turns out almost as a natural side effect to be far more attractive than desperate pursuit, and how you can start building that security from the inside instead of faking it from the outside. The philosopher Epictetus, one of the great Stoic teachers, observed that people are not disturbed by things, but by the views they take of them. And this applies directly to the pursuit of love. When you view a woman's approval as essential to your well-being, you become disturbed by every silence, every delayed reply, every ambiguous signal. That disturbance is what pushes her away. The disturbance is what she feels, even if she cannot name it. Let us start by understanding exactly what happens psychologically when someone insistently pursues another person. When you send a second message without having received a reply to the first, when you cancel your own plans just to be available the moment the other person finally has some free time, when you adjust your personality, your opinions, or your interests to come across as more agreeable, you are communicating something much deeper than you realize, even if you never say any of it out loud. You are communicating that your emotional well-being depends to a large extent on that specific person's response. And human beings instinctively pick up on that dependency fairly clearly, even when they cannot put it into exact words. This is where it is worth pausing on a fundamental concept from behavioral psychology, the so-called scarcity principle. This principle, studied extensively in social psychology, describes a very old and deeply rooted tendency of the human mind. We disproportionately value whatever we perceive as limited, hard to get, or potentially fleeting, and we almost automatically discount the value of whatever feels fully available at any moment. This tendency did not originate with romantic relationships. It is a much older mechanism inherited from a past in which scarce resources like food or shelter demanded special attention while abundant resources could be taken for granted without any risk. When we bring this principle into the emotional realm, something fairly counterintuitive shows up. When a person is available at all times, with no limits whatsoever, with no life of their own competing for their time and attention, the other person's brain tends to process that availability almost as if it were an unlimited resource, and therefore not something urgent to value or work for. There is no need to fight for something that is always going to be there. This explains to a large extent why constant pursuit tends to produce the opposite of the intended effect. Instead of increasing interest, it tends to dilute it. Now, I want to make an important nuance absolutely clear at this point, because otherwise we would risk falling into the very trap I criticized at the start of the video. Understanding this principle does not mean you should artificially fake being busy or play at strategically disappearing with the sole purpose of generating anxiety in the other person. That kind of behavior, even if it can look effective in the short term, is a form of emotional manipulation. And sooner or later, it builds relationships based on mutual insecurity instead of genuine trust. What we are talking about here is something quite different. Having a real, unfaked life of your own that is full enough that your time and attention carry authentic value, not artificially inflated value. The philosopher Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, taught that the goal of life is to live in agreement with nature. When you are living in agreement with your own nature, pursuing your own goals, building your own life, you do not need to fake scarcity. Your time naturally becomes valuable because you are actually using it for things that matter to you. Now, I want to tell you about another psychological mechanism that is key to understanding this whole issue, so-called intermittent reinforcement, a concept studied extensively in behavioral psychology for many decades now. This phenomenon describes something fairly curious about how learning works. When a reward arrives predictably and consistently, the behavior seeking it tends to weaken over time because there is no longer any uncertainty about the outcome. But when that same reward arrives unpredictably, sometimes yes and sometimes no, the behavior pursuing it becomes far more persistent, almost obsessive, because the mind keeps searching for the next time the reward shows up. Now, and it is absolutely essential that you listen closely to this because this is exactly where so much shallow relationship content gets it seriously wrong. Deliberately using this principle to keep someone hooked, calculatedly alternating warmth and coldness, is not psychology applied in a healthy way. It is outright emotional manipulation, and it can create in the other person a dependency similar to what is seen in certain addictive patterns. I am not suggesting you use this mechanism as a strategy. I am explaining it to you so you understand why certain toxic dynamics are so hard to walk away from, and so you learn to recognize them, both when you are on the receiving end and when, without realizing it, you are the one applying them out of insecurity rather than conscious calculation. Let us get back then to the territory of genuine psychological health, which is really the heart of this whole video. There is a concept I want to introduce now that is essential for understanding why inner security is so attractive without needing any calculated strategy at all. The so-called psychological frame, a term describing the internal structure of beliefs, values, and expectations through which a person interprets any social interaction. A man with a weak psychological frame tends to enter any romantic interaction from an implicit position of begging. He perceives the other person as a prize he has to win at any cost, and he behaves accordingly, adjusting himself, pleasing, avoiding any possible conflict rather than risk the approval he needs so badly. A man with a solid psychological frame, on the other hand, enters any interaction from a completely different position. He does not just ask himself whether the other person likes him. He also asks himself just as seriously whether that person actually fits into the life he himself is building. This difference, subtle as it looks on the surface, radically changes the energy given off in any interaction. It is not about arrogance or feeling superior to anyone. It is simply about evaluating in both directions instead of begging in only one. The philosopher Seneca, another great Stoic, wrote that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. And when you waste your time begging for approval instead of building your own life, you are wasting the opportunity to become someone worth approving. I want to pause here on something I consider essential because it connects directly to the psychological root of this whole pattern of desperate pursuit, the relationship between self-worth and outside approval. When a man builds his sense of personal worth almost exclusively on romantic approval from other people, any sign of disinterest becomes psychologically a direct threat to his very identity, not just a passing disappointment. This explains why so many people find it so hard to let go, so hard to stop insisting, even when they rationally know perfectly well the situation has no future. They are not just defending one particular relationship without realizing it. They are defending their own sense of being worth something. This dynamic tends to have fairly deep roots, often tied to how affection was experienced during childhood. When as a child, love felt conditional, when you had to behave a certain way, meet certain expectations, or avoid certain behaviors in order to get approval from the important figures in your life, it is fairly likely that as an adult, That same pattern repeats itself within romantic relationships, chasing almost automatically a validation that never quite feels fully secure, no matter how much of it is obtained. Recognizing this pattern does not mean staying stuck forever, blaming the past for how you relate to others in the present. It means rather understanding the origin of the automatic response so you can finally start interrupting it consciously instead of repeating it endlessly without even noticing. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic, wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. When your thoughts are colored by the belief that your worth depends on her approval, your soul reflects that. You become anxious, desperate, and ultimately unattractive. But when your thoughts are colored by the belief that you are whole with or without her, your soul reflects that too. And that wholeness is what draws others to you. Now I want to talk about something I consider one of the most important pillars of this whole topic, one that is often completely overlooked in shallow conversations about attraction: personal purpose. A man who has clear goals, projects that genuinely excite him, interests that exist entirely apart from any romantic relationship, gives off something no seduction technique can fake for long. The sense that his existence has meaning of its own, regardless of how any particular love story turns out. This has absolutely nothing to do with bragging about achievements or building an artificial image of success to impress someone else. It has to do with something much quieter and much more genuine: the inner coherence of someone who is building his own life with or without company and who receives any relationship as a valuable addition, not as the missing piece that makes him feel complete. I want you to think about this from another angle. When a person's entire vital energy is concentrated exclusively on getting or keeping a romantic relationship, that relationship ends up carrying a completely disproportionate weight. A weight that no human relationship, however healthy, can sustain indefinitely without cracking. No other person can sustainably be the sole source of meaning, identity, and self-worth for another human being. When this happens, the relationship stops being a meeting place between two whole people and turns into a kind of psychological life support system with all the pressure and imbalance that entails. By contrast, when each person in a relationship maintains their own purpose, their own projects, their own network of meaningful relationships beyond the couple, the relationship can breathe far more freely. It is no longer about needing the other person to survive emotionally, but about choosing them day after day from a place of fullness rather than lack. And this difference, subtle as it may look on paper, is absolutely noticeable in practice, both for the person living it and for anyone watching from outside. Now, I want to talk about personal boundaries because this concept is often misunderstood. Setting boundaries does not mean becoming cold, distant, or calculating. It means having complete clarity about which behaviors you are willing to accept within any relationship and which you are not, regardless of how much you like the other person. A man capable of saying no without over-explaining himself, capable of keeping his personal commitments instead of constantly cancelling them out of anxiety about always being available, gives off something deeply attractive from a psychological standpoint. The sense that his inner well-being does not depend exclusively on that specific person's approval. This does not mean you have to become rigid or turn every small disagreement into a test of character. It simply means that your own commitments, your own time, and your own well-being deserve the same respect you are willing to offer the other person. When someone systematically cancels their own plans, their own routines, their own projects just to be available at any moment for someone else, that is not a particularly deep demonstration of love. It is a demonstration, almost always without realizing it, that they believe their own life is worth less than the possibility of pleasing someone else. The philosopher Cleanthes, who succeeded Zeno as the head of the Stoic school, wrote that the fates guide the willing, but drag the unwilling. When you are willing to set boundaries, when you are willing to say no, you are guided toward healthier relationships. But when you are unwilling, when you let fear of losing someone dictate all your choices, you are dragged into patterns of resentment and exhaustion. Now, I want to bring in an important nuance about another concept often mentioned in conversations about attraction: mystery. It is true that revealing absolutely everything about yourself from the very first moment, leaving no room at all for curiosity or gradual discovery, can reduce some of the natural tension that exists in any relationship that is just beginning. but it is worth understanding clearly which kind of mystery is healthy and which is not. Healthy mystery does not consist of deliberately withholding information with the calculated goal of seeming more interesting. It consists rather of something much more natural. A person with a rich, constantly developing life simply has more layers to discover organically because they keep growing, keep having new experiences, keep evolving as a person instead of exhausting their entire identity in the first few conversations. Calculated mystery, on the other hand, the kind that involves replying late on purpose, faking less interest than you actually feel, deliberately playing with the other person's uncertainty to generate anxiety, does not build genuine attraction. At best, it builds interest based on uncertainty, which tends to fall apart as soon as the relationship moves toward real closeness, precisely because it was never built on authentic foundations. Now, I want to talk about reciprocity, because it is perhaps the most important concept we have discussed so far, and the one that most clearly sums up the difference between a healthy relationship and an unbalanced dynamic of pursuit. A healthy relationship is not built on one person constantly investing time, energy, and attention while the other passively receives without offering anything equivalent in return. It is built on a relatively balanced exchange where both people feel they are investing and both feel they are genuinely getting something back. When that reciprocity does not exist, when one person is doing practically all the work while the other simply receives without a similar level of effort in return, we are not talking about a temporarily unbalanced relationship that just needs time to adjust. In most cases, we are talking about a dynamic that is unlikely to turn into anything healthy, no matter how much extra effort gets poured in from just one side. Recognizing this in time without clinging to the hope that the situation will magically change someday is one of the most mature decisions anyone can make within an unbalanced relationship. Now, I want to address something I think is especially important to mention because the subject we are covering today tends to get generalized in a pretty problematic way in a lot of the content circulating about it. The idea that all women, without exception, operate according to the exact same psychological patterns, automatically feeling attracted to men who are hard to get. This generalization, though very common in certain corners of relationship content, oversimplifies something much more complex. People, regardless of gender, are extremely diverse in how they experience attraction. And that diversity depends on each individual's personal history, their own attachment style, their own past experiences, and their own particular way of understanding love. What does seem to hold up fairly consistently beyond any oversimplified generalization about one gender is something far more universal: autonomy. Genuine self-esteem, healthy boundaries, and a meaningful life of one's own tend to favor more balanced, more lasting relationships than extreme dependency and desperate pursuit, regardless of who is showing that pattern of behavior. Now, I want to offer you something much more concrete, something you can start applying to your own life starting today, beyond all the theory we have covered up to this point. Before sending that message you have been hesitating over, before cancelling that plan of your own just to stay available, ask yourself honestly, am I doing this because I genuinely want to, or am I doing this because I am afraid of losing something I do not even have yet? This question, simple as it looks, has enormous power to interrupt automatic patterns that have been running unsupervised for years. Another equally valuable practice is to periodically and honestly review how much energy you are investing in your own life compared to how much energy you are investing in earning someone else's approval. If you notice that your own projects, your own friendships, your own personal goals have been pushed to the background while all your attention concentrates on a single person, that is a clear sign the balance has been broken and that it might be time to reconnect with your own life before continuing to invest in someone else's. I also want to mention the importance of surrounding yourself with people, projects, and activities that give you back a sense of self-worth independent of any specific romantic relationship. The richer and fuller your life is outside the romantic realm, the less you will need to depend emotionally on a single source of validation. And that emotional independence, far from pushing healthy relationships away, tends to be precisely what makes them possible. I want to close this video with a reflection I consider fundamental, one that sums up the whole spirit of what we have talked about today. The real goal of working on your own inner security is not to learn more sophisticated techniques for getting someone to notice you. The real goal is to stop desperately needing someone to notice you in order to feel your life has meaning. When that inner shift genuinely happens, not as a calculated performance, something curious tends to occur almost as a side effect. The relationships you start building stop being based on the fear of losing someone and start being built on a much sturdier foundation. Two whole people choosing to be together, not because they desperately need each other, but because from the fullness of their own lives they decide to share the journey. This is not about giving up pursuing someone just to start pursuing instead a new strategy disguised as emotional maturity. It is about giving up pursuit altogether and starting instead to build your own life, your own purpose, your own sense of worth, so that any relationship that comes along afterward does so as a genuine addition to something that was already whole on its own, rather than as a desperate patch over a void that only you can ever learn to fill. I want to go a little deeper into something I mentioned at the start of the video because it deserves a much more detailed explanation. The exact difference between validating someone constantly and validating them selectively, and why this distinction matters so much psychologically. When a person praises absolutely everything the other one does, when every message, every comment, every gesture receives the exact same amount of overflowing enthusiasm, that validation quickly loses its ability to generate any real emotional impact. The human brain processes new information far more intensely than repetitive, predictable information. If every word from you comes wrapped in the same level of unconditional approval, the other person has no way left to tell what is genuinely valuable apart from what is simply part of your habitual behavior toward them. Selective validation, understood in a healthy way and not as a manipulative strategy, is something much simpler than it sounds. Expressing approval and affection genuinely, reserving it for moments when you truly feel something worth acknowledging instead of handing it out automatically over every single interaction. This does not mean becoming stingy with affection or carefully rationing every word as if it were a scarce currency. It simply means being honest about what you actually feel in each moment instead of artificially inflating your enthusiasm in the hope of pleasing more. Now, I want to address something rarely mentioned in conversations about attraction, but that is absolutely central from a clinical psychology perspective: the relationship between attachment anxiety and the inability to tolerate uncertainty within a relationship. When a person experiences a high level of anxiety around the possibility of losing someone, their nervous system interprets any silence, any delayed reply, any ambiguous signal as an imminent threat that must be resolved as soon as possible. This interpretation, while completely understandable emotionally, tends to push people toward behaviors that end up producing exactly the outcome they were afraid of in the first place. Think of this as a self-feeding loop. The anxiety generates an urgent need to resolve the uncertainty. That urgent need pushes toward pursuit behaviors, repeated messages, constant questions about the state of the relationship, a need for frequent, explicit confirmation. Those behaviors in turn tend to create in the other person a sense of pressure that pushes them further away. And that distancing finally confirms the original anxiety, closing the loop and reinforcing the pattern for next time. Breaking this loop does not happen just by deciding overnight to stop feeling anxious. Attachment anxiety tends to have deep roots, and forcing yourself to ignore it without properly working through it can end up creating even more damaging emotional suppression down the line. What is actually possible with consistent practice and patience is learning to recognize the exact moment the anxiety starts activating and developing the ability to sit with that discomfort without immediately translating it into an impulsive behavior. This ability, known in certain therapeutic circles as tolerance for uncertainty, is one of the most valuable emotional skills a man can develop throughout his entire relational life. I want to share a mental exercise that can be especially useful the next time you feel that urgent impulse to seek immediate confirmation within an early-stage relationship. Instead of immediately asking yourself, "What can I do to get this person to respond?" Ask yourself first, "What would I be doing right now if this person did not exist in my life at all?" What project would you have pending? What activity do you genuinely enjoy and have been putting off for a while? What conversation with a friend have you been wanting to have for weeks? And then, instead of sitting there waiting for a reply with your phone in hand, direct that energy toward that specific activity. Not as a tactic to appear busy, but as a real, honest way of reminding yourself that your life still has meaning of its own, regardless of what happens with that particular interaction. I also want to talk about a very common mistake many men make when trying to apply these principles without properly understanding them: confusing security with indifference. Genuine security does not mean no longer showing interest or pretending not to care about someone who genuinely matters to you. It means rather showing that interest honestly and directly without hiding it out of fear of seeming needy, but without that interest becoming the entirety of your identity or the absolute center your whole emotional life revolves around. You can tell someone quite naturally that you really enjoyed their company, that you would like to see them again soon, without that same gesture turning into a constant flood of messages that end up communicating anxiety instead of genuine interest. The difference between expressing genuine interest and pursuing out of anxiety is not so much in the specific words used, but in the emotional energy behind them. A message written from a place of calm conveys something completely different from that same message written out of desperation, even if the literal content is nearly identical. People almost instinctively pick up on that difference in energy, even when they cannot explain it in exact words. I want to close this part of the video by talking about something I consider absolutely essential, and that tends to be left out of most content about attraction and relationships entirely: the role of time and patience in building this kind of inner security. Nothing we have talked about today gets resolved overnight just from having listened to this video to the end. Genuine security is not a switch that flips all at once. It is more like a muscle that strengthens little by little, practice after practice, conscious choice after conscious choice. Every time you choose to respond from calm instead of fear, every time you choose to invest in your own life instead of chasing someone else's approval, you are building that muscle. There will be days you slip up, when the urge to send that extra message or cancel that plan of your own will feel nearly irresistible. That does not mean the process is not working. It simply means you are trying to change a pattern that has probably been in place for years, maybe decades, in the way you relate to others. Every small victory, however insignificant it seems in the moment, gradually builds a much more stable, much more complete version of yourself. One that, curiously enough, is far more capable of building healthy, lasting relationships than any calculated seduction strategy could ever have offered you. I want to end with the idea I consider the true core of everything we have covered together in this video. The end goal is not learning to become more attractive through any particular technique. The end goal is building a life that is already on its own full enough, coherent enough, and truly yours enough that any relationship you decide to build from here on out does so out of the freedom to choose rather than out of the desperate need to be chosen. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote that a man's worth is no greater than the worth of his ambitions. When your ambition is to build a life that does not depend on anyone else's approval, your worth becomes solid and unshakable. Before I go, I want to tell you something that tends to illustrate everything we have talked about today better than any theoretical explanation could. Picture two very different men, both interested in the same person, both with genuine, honest intentions, with no bad intent involved at all. The first one organizes every day of his week around the possibility of receiving a message. He checks his phone constantly. He postpones his own plans at the slightest chance that she might have some free time. His friends start noticing he barely talks about anything other than this budding relationship. Every word, every gesture, every silence from the other person becomes material for constant analysis, an endless search for clues about what she truly feels for him. The second man, on the other hand, carries on with his week exactly as he would have before meeting her. He works out when he had already planned to work out. He meets his friends when he had already arranged to. He keeps making progress on the personal project he has been genuinely excited about for months. When she writes to him, he replies with real warmth, not hiding that he enjoys the conversation, but also not needing to turn that conversation into the central event of his day. If a couple of days go by without talking, he does not automatically read it as a tragedy, just as a normal part of two lives that are still getting to know each other. I do not need to tell you which of the two men gives off without even trying a far more attractive and far more sustainable energy over time. But I want you to notice something even more important than the external outcome of this comparison. Even if for whatever reason the relationship did not end up working out in either case, The second man walks away from that experience with his life intact, with his emotional well-being relatively stable, able to keep moving forward without feeling that some fundamental part of himself has collapsed. The first man, on the other hand, probably walks away from that same experience feeling like he lost far more than he actually had, precisely because he put a disproportionate amount of his own sense of personal worth into that one possibility. That at its core is the most important difference between the two paths we have explored throughout this entire video. One of them leaves you completely exposed to having your well-being depend on factors you are never going to fully control, like another person's availability, interest, or life circumstances. The other lets you fully take part in love with all the genuine vulnerability that involves, without your inner stability getting completely hijacked in the process. Building that second way of living out relationships does not happen from reading a single article or watching a single video. However convincing it feels in the moment, it happens little by little every time you choose to invest in your own growth instead of anxiously chasing someone else's approval. Every time you decide to treat your own time, your own projects, and your own well-being with the same respect you would demand for any other important person in your life. And over time, almost without setting out to, you will start noticing something curious. The relationships that come into your life from that point on will no longer arrive looking to fill an urgent void, but will calmly add themselves to something you had already built long before they ever showed up. If you made it to the end of this video, comment "I matter," and I will personally reply to you myself. And if this resonated with you, subscribe to be part of it and hit like if you enjoyed it.